one last thing, I'm sorry. Jonathan Hedinger was the reporter on this story. If I failed to introduce him, I'm sorry.
Okay, there he
All
is.
right, here we
Um,
go.
okay, as Pam said, I'm Brant Houston. I'm Night Chair of Investigative Reporting at the University of Illinois. Still a very active journalist, doing way too much editing and not enough reporting. But I've been fascinated by this topic for the last decade in particular because of these kinds of projects. So before we get into our conversation, I'd like to ask Jonathan to just let's talk about a few of the major points of the story you just did, and maybe we'll put a link into it in the chat at some point. Uh, but Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, well, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the panelists for talking to me from the story, and then also just for coming today. As Brant was kind of saying a little bit earlier, he's been interested in this story for a decade, and we've been talking about how to kind of do a story on these projects for quite a while, and 80 because it was just technology that seems really fascinating, but it's also something that seems a little academic, hard to, I guess, get a good grasp on. And so we kept trying to look at different ways to see how this is working and how realistic it is and things like that. So I remember in 2017, when ADM first launched the Illinois Carbon Capture and Storage Project, they at Indicator, their ethanol plant, we went and toured it, me and our photo editor Daryl Holman, and kind of looked around and did stuff like that. But we finally decided this year to look at how much federal money they've gotten and how the project's working. And so there was basically ADM over the past since 2009 or so has received $281 million for different carbon capture and storage projects. There's been a few different just projects to look at scope and see what type of projects can be done. And then there was a first project called the Illinois Basin Decatur Project, where they put in 1 million tons over 5 years. And then the second project, the Illinois Carbon Capture and Storage Project, which they launched in 2017, and they said was going to be storing 1 million tons a year. As we found for the story, though, ADM has yet to reach that total. They are more like 500,000, 525,000, 519,000 tons each year. And they said that that's because they haven't been using the ethanol plant quite to capacity. And so basically they aren't producing as much carbon as they wanted to, or as they would normally if they were using the ethanol plant to capacity. So this project cost $208 million initially, but 144 million of that came from the Department of Energy. And then through the 45Q tax credit, ADM was supposed to be able to recover $20 for every ton that they stored. So the idea was they would get $100 million for storing tons over 5 years. And then they would be able to make that money back. But overall, even though they've been storing carbon from this ethanol plant at that facility, total emissions went up from 4.2 million in 2016 to 4.4 million tons of carbon last year in 2019.
So Jonathan, one of the things that is an editor on the story and a promoter of this story, initially I said, Jonathan, I want to extend my understanding past this definition of carbon capture, which is dig a hole 7,000 feet in the ground and pour pollutants into it. So Jonathan came back and I now understand a whole lot more about carbon capture. So go ahead. So,
yeah, exactly. And that's, I mean, so yeah, we've learned kind of that this is something that could, especially, it was kind of started to be designed for a lot of coal plants and natural gas plants and things like that, but it's might have a good usage at places like ethanol and fertilizer plants. But that's something kind of want to ask, I think, the panelists about a bit later. And then the other thing that I just kind of wanted to talk about was ADM, even though they've gotten all this money and they've started this project, they've proved the technology can work. Um, what does that mean? What will it take to scale up this technology? That's what we kind of what the panelists, I think, to talk about. And ADM, even though they have proven that this works, they released a long-term feasibility study for reducing greenhouse gas emissions earlier this year. And they said that they aren't going to be able to ramp this up in a significant way for at least 10 years. And so if they aren't counting on it, I kind of begs the question, who is, and when is this going to be a realistic technology? And then I think the last thing I want to talk about was just, I know we have quite a few people from Illinois here, and the University of Illinois identified different places and different projects that could have this technology installed in the future, and different places to ramp it up in the Illinois Basin. And here's a list of that, which includes everything from the Abbott power plant on campus at the U of I, to the Cronus fertilizer plant that may or may not happen near Tuscola, to the Prairie State Generating Company down in Washington, Illinois, and all these other places that we see.
All set? Great. I was thinking I'd just start off with a more generic question, and from things I learned from the article and other readings I've done, which is the coal industry is shrinking through market forces, it appears. And initially, I think this was aimed, and correct me if I'm wrong, at coal plants. And then there's been some other comments that maybe tax credits or trading of coal credits or whatever, carbon credits would be more effective. So I guess I'd ask Greg, what do you think of the future of this now? Because I think some things came into play, at least that I didn't hear of 10 years ago, in terms of what's happened to the coal industry. So how do you think this will be shaped or reshaped as we go along, this kind of technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the dynamics of the coal industry are really important to take into account right now. It's really transforming the US energy system in a way that no one would have predicted 10 years ago. I think anyone who would have hoped that many coal plants would have shut down would have been thought of as being silly. So it's really been dramatic that a quarter of the US coal fleet is shut down in the last 10 years. One distinction I would make when we're talking about these types of projects, like the one indicator, are technologies that keep carbon in the ground. So you can dig up coal, burn it, and then potentially put that carbon that you get when you burn it back into the ground. And so you're kind of a net neutral fuel if that works. And the distinct different thing about the Decatur plant, which is they're taking carbon that's in the atmosphere, using photosynthesis in corn, taking carbon from the atmosphere, putting it into corn, fermenting it, and then capturing that CO2 in the fermentation process and putting that underground. And so that's different. That's not keeping carbon in the ground. That's taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into the ground. And that's the first time we've ever done that, other than like growing more trees or something like that. So that is what people are especially interested in. If we're thinking about doing something, you know, what we may need to do for climate change, if we're trying to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, which is what the US and other countries agreed on 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago, we need to reduce our emissions to close to zero by mid-century. And if you assume that we may not get our act together right away to do that, and two, that there may be parts of our economy that are just hard to get to zero, like aviation, agriculture, some industrial processes. So if we still are emitting from those things a little bit in 2050 or so, we're going to have to find some way to offset that. And the only way to offset that is to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it underground. And the first plant to do that is that one at Decatur. So a lot has been put on that as kind of demonstrating the technology. And, you know, I've been writing about this for 3 or 4 years, and I keep saying there's only one full-scale plant that does this in the world, Decatur. And every time I do it, and this happened last week, I was doing some stuff for the IPCC, I have to keep checking to make sure that's still true. And it's still true. So there really has not been, you know, this kind of growth around the world. It's not happening in China. It's not happening in Europe. It's not happening anywhere else. It's this one plant. And so it kind of Yeah, it begs the question of when this is really going to take off, and is this going to actually be a technology we can rely on? Because if we're talking about stringent climate policy, I do think we're going to have to do some removal. I'd like to minimize that, but that's kind of the challenge we have ahead of us. So a lot was riding on Decatur for that.
Okay. And David, I think you've had some thoughts about the potential of this, and I think countered it with some other possible strategies. So I'd certainly like to get your viewpoint, your comments.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, the issue with carbon capture and storage is not really so much with the technology, it's with the policy envelope that surrounds the technology. Looked at other social problems the way we're pursuing this. The problem is that putting CO2 into the air hurts people. And there ought to be rules that prevent companies from hurting people. Imagine if we approached drunk driving the way we're approaching carbon capture and storage. We would like you not to drive drunk, and we'll offer you a payment if you don't drive drunk. And that's our program for addressing drunk driving. That'd be a pretty crummy policy. And that's the problem with our approach to this technology. It dates back 20 years. This approach of paying people dates 20 years to the George W. Bush administration, when it was the official policy of the United States not to do anything to require reductions in carbon pollution. Then the Obama administration came in and that policy changed. Then the Trump administration came in and that policy changed back. And 5 or 6 weeks from now, President-elect Biden will take office and that policy will change again. However, the constant throughout this 20-year period has been that Congress has refused to adopt meaningful legislation to actually require cuts in pollution. So we have this approach of build some projects to capture carbon. It's a failed approach. I say it's a failed approach, not because we haven't learned some useful technical information. It's because it's not doing the job of actually reducing carbon pollution at a scale that we need to protect all of us who live on planet Earth.
So it seems to me we're jumping into one of the points of this story pretty quickly. And I take Greg's point that there's technology that's been proven in this, and also his point that it's not being replicated successfully. In fact, in Jonathan's work, he found these other plants that just had not got to the finish mark. Some had just not really gotten off the ground or into the ground, as you might have it. So I guess one question to follow up on is, are the economics of this realistic at this point? And let's say under the Biden administration, is there any thought that there'll be billions of dollars again to encourage people to do this technology or something like it? And I take your point, David, if you don't want to have pollution, don't put it in the air in the first place. But that's, we still have this economic incentive between tax credits and actual grants and loans. So if both of you would comment on that, do you think the economics are going to work out in this? I guess I go to Greg first and back to Dave.
Yeah, well, okay, fine.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
Go ahead, Greg. Well, I was going to just say, the economics of carbon capture are interesting. There are many less expensive ways to avoid carbon pollution today. Building more renewable energy faster is one of the best. Energy efficiency investments is even better. It's, as Amory Lovins likes to say, it's a lunch that they pay you to eat. It doesn't actually have a net cost to the customer. It saves money and it avoids pollution. So, if the challenge of protecting the climate was just doing the cheapest things today, the answer would be simple. But that's not the challenge. In order to protect the climate, we've got to bring emissions to zero. And to bring emissions to zero, we're not only going to be able to do the things that are very cheap today, we're going to have to do some more expensive things. And one of the advantages of carbon capture, of doing research and work on carbon capture and storage, is the hope that you would bring the cost of that technology. So when you get to the harder parts of the climate protection problem, you know, this is like climbing Mount Everest, and it may, I've never done that or any hard mountain, but it may be that the first couple of stages are relatively easy, but then it gets harder and you need new tools in order to make it to the top. And carbon capture and storage could be one of those tools to help us make it to the top.
So it's an investment. Greg?
I completely agree with everything David just said. That's exactly the way I see it. There's so many other ways to reduce our carbon emissions that can go a long way. The unbelievable cost reductions in renewables over the last 10 years, the development of low-cost electric vehicles that allow us to use clean energy for transportation now, and then just untapped potential on energy efficiency that allows you to do everything less on the supply side. So even use less batteries and use less solar, because all of those things at scale will have some effect. So we need to do all of those things. And yeah, I also agree that to get that last, whatever it is, 10 or 20% that will be important to clean up, we'll probably need something like this carbon removal. And just to, you know, the one kind of physical science characteristic of this that I always make sure my students like really understand about this is we've had a lot of success in US environmental policy of cleaning up the air with reducing sulfur dioxide, NOx emissions, and particulates, and there's fewer kids going to hospitals and there's less asthma, and that's all been a huge achievement. But those chemicals get rained out of the atmosphere in days to weeks. And when you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it stays for a century and more for some of it. And so you don't have this luxury that, oh, if we eventually get our act together tomorrow, we'll get a clean sky. You can do that. Like Beijing did it before the Olympics for a week and all of a sudden they had clean skies. We can't get rid of our climate problem that way because we're stuck with it. So some removal to clean up what's left over is probably going to be important. And so a technology program that creates a few demonstrations that shows that it works, that gets the cost down, I think that's a good, important thing to do. And that's probably the best role that the Decatur plant can play with what we have now.
So it sounds like you both feel there'll probably be some continued investment in the technology because of the contribution it can make at some point, especially if the cost is driven down. It's because
yeah, but it's a harder sell now because, you know, now we're talking about cleaning up the last 10% in 30 years. 15 years ago, as David was saying, under the Bush administration, our primary response to climate change was to say, we can still burn fossil fuels, we can still have a coal industry, we can have a natural gas industry, and those can grow because we've got this technology to clean them up and still burn those. Some sort of like we have catalytic converters on automobiles. And, you know, that has just fallen away. It's just like people don't talk about it that way anymore. So the idea that there's going to be this giant industry that's on our doorstep of cleaning up coal plants with carbon capture, that was a big deal 15 years ago. And that people don't talk about that now because you can't even operate a coal plant just putting coal and burning it and putting it into the atmosphere and then add another $1 billion of equipment. No one's going to do that. So it's harder. It's harder now. It's a longer term play to do this.
And Jonathan had brought up in discussions during the story and in the story itself that some of this may be better applied to the ethanol industry or other industries than coal. That it may be that these efforts will be redirected. Does that seem likely, David?
Well, you know, actually the current subsidy program is really a windfall for the ethanol industry. The tax credits that are available are actually greater than the cost. And why is that? It's because in order to make ethanol, the process requires separating out the CO2 from the feedstock in the plant. That's the most expensive part of carbon capture and storage. So that's already paid for as a cost of making the product ethanol. So the subsidy more than covers the additional expense of compressing that CO2 and injecting it into the ground. There's so many reforms to this whole subsidy program. The first is to phase out the subsidy and replace it with a program that actually requires reducing carbon emissions. If we did that, there'd still be costs associated with using things like carbon capture, but the costs would be borne by the consumers of the products that were using that technology. And that's the way it ought to be, because that creates an incentive to use alternatives. In the power sector, a great example, if you subsidized the coal or natural gas power producers to use carbon capture, you're interfering with the greater use of renewable energy. It would be much more sensible to say the power sector in the United States needs to cut its emissions to zero by a certain year, starting now, and the cost will be borne by the types of electric generation that are subject to the rules. That means that the high emitting plants, like existing coal plants, will incur the gas plants will be used more sparingly, and renewables would get an even greater growth spurt. So that moves everything in the right direction. It's a very simple policy formulation to state, but it's taken more than 30 years for us, and we still haven't found the answer to actually make the policy happen politically. This is not a technical problem. It's not an economic problem. It's a political problem.
Okay. Pam, do we have any questions? It looks like we might in the chat, and then we'll come back. I have some more questions, but
We do.
when I get on Zoom, I hate waiting for my questions. So
Sure. From Greg Hubert, maybe jumping the gun for this question, wonder if any of you will try to look in detail at the Prairie State Coal Project's carbon capture project. The economics don't seem to make sense to me for all the captive muni co-op ratepayers who will own the lifetime of capital and operating cost. There's also some evidence now that PSEC is already near the point of falling below break even.
So I don't know if anyone is really familiar with this particular project. So it may be something for Jonathan and I to talk about. I don't know, Greg, have you looked at this project at all?
I haven't looked at that
Okay.
project, but the question implies correctly who's going to pay for it, right? I mean, it's ratepayers that pay for projects like this.
Yeah.
That's not true for an ethanol plant, but it's true for an electricity plant like that one.
Got it. Okay. And then we had another one, Pam. I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
It was John, me. I was just going to say, I did talk to some people at the University of Illinois who were looking at the future plans, and I know that this was one of them. And again, I think that the Prairie State project is another type of demonstration project where it's trying to figure out, does this technology work? How do we scale it up? And then figuring out later, I guess, who's going to pay for it. So I think that the projects so far have been funded through federal Department of Energy grants, like the one that went to ADM.
Okay, thanks. We had another one, Pam.
Right, from Daniel Doyle. Curious to hear comparisons between nature-based solutions to carbon capture, such as perennial cover via trees or prairie, increased biodiversity, Region AG, versus existing technological solutions, such as what ADM is doing, efficiency, cost effectiveness, long-term sustainability, etc.
So David, did you want to address it? I think, Greg?
Sure.
Okay.
I can start. Well, nature-based solutions are very good ideas for climate, but also for general ecosystem health. Ecosystems are healthier if they store more carbon. Soils are healthier if they store more carbon. Forests provide wonderful habitat for diverse ecosystems, which are really a huge asset to human civilization, but of course have value in their own right. So doing things to protect existing forests, to restore damaged forests, and to restore damaged soil, those are all great things to do. That said, most studies indicate that the scale of available carbon sequestration opportunities in natural systems is not large enough to get us all the way to the top of the mountain that I was describing. We have a huge job ahead of us, and that doesn't mean we should not pursue these natural climate solutions. It just means that we're probably going to need techniques in addition to those. There's one final point I would make about the natural climate solutions, which is what I'll call the caretaker responsibility. Carbon that is stored in soil and stored in trees and other vegetation is not locked up the way carbon that is stored in rocks is vulnerable to the very problem that we're trying to address, climate disruption. Look what happens when we have wildfires in places like California. All the carbon that was in those trees is now in the atmosphere. So that imposes on our future generations a caretaker responsibility. The more we rely on these natural climate solutions as a climate protection technique, as opposed to an ecosystem improvement technique, the greater the caretaker obligations we are imposing on the future generations. That is different for geologic carbon sequestration, because the physics of geologic carbon sequestration is that starting within a few decades, the carbon that you inject into these formations starts to get mineralized. It first loses its buoyancy, so it reduces the risk of a release, and then it starts getting turned back into minerals, into rock, at which point there is no danger of a release to the atmosphere. Now that takes hundreds of years, so you have a caretaker responsibility and a regulatory regime that you need, but the regulatory regime doesn't have to be as long lasting as it would for protection of the increased soil carbon and increased forest stocks that the natural solutions would require.
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I agree about that's a good way to put it, and how important that permanence of storage is and that caretaker responsibility, because we're talking about needing to store this for hundreds of years, and it's not something that gets taken care of right away. So yeah, so the natural-based solutions have the benefits that David talked about, and I think it's maybe good to maybe think about what the opposite means, these unnatural solutions or engineered solutions. And one way to do that is to use machines and chemicals and heat and electricity and remove CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. And there's some companies that are trying to do that, and then they pressurize it and pump it underground, and it's meant to stay there. The interesting thing about the Decatur plant and that type of technology, which sometimes comes under this broader idea of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, is it does both. So you need the crops. So you've got corn that you're using to make the ethanol, and then you're doing the pressurization and pumping it underground, as David talked about. And so the Decatur plant is kind of a combination of the natural, or the photosynthesis part of natural-based solutions, with the permanent storage of these kind of chemical-based, or sometimes called direct air capture solutions. So that's, Decatur kind of brings it all together. The other part about these natural-based solutions, including the Decatur type of bioenergy carbon capture, is, as David mentioned, if we do need to remove tens of billions of tons a year, which is what some of these models of how we deal with climate change say, so that's 25% of our emissions today are going to go the other way from the atmosphere into the ground. And we're going to do it with natural solutions. That's a lot of land. That's a lot of space. And some of that is preserving forests, and there's biodiversity benefits, and storing it in soils can even increase crop yields, and that's great. But some of it may not. Some of it may be monoculture, because you engineer a strain of tree that maximizes the amount of carbon that you can remove quickly, or root systems that do the same. And so, it could be that they're natural, but they're not, benign landscapes that provide a lot of other benefits that some of the more kind of complex and biodiverse natural systems we get to know are. So it can be done, natural can be done well, and it can be done in a way that feels more like industrial type agriculture than about kind of a healthy forest.
I had a question off the text. Are there any general misconceptions you think that people have when you're in conversations that they have about carbon sequestration? Is there anything that you find that people are assuming, or anything like that in particular that it'd be good to share some knowledge on? Like, are there assumptions maybe?
Yeah, I'll speak to one of them, which as I can speak from experience, because when I first started looking at this issue, more than 20 years ago, I had some of these misconceptions. But it relates to, okay, what happens when you stick the CO2 underground? And there are some people who think that what we're talking about is finding big underground caves, essentially big empty formations, and then pumping these CO2 gases into these caves and filling them up and hoping they don't pop.
Mhm.
Well, that's not the technology. What we're talking about are geologic formations that consist of very porous rock, like sandstone. And that porous rock, because it's porous, has a lot of very tiny empty spaces in it. It's also filled with a very salty water solution, the so-called brine. And what happens is when you inject the CO2 into these formations, the CO2 is lighter than the formation is, and so you have to make sure that on top of that formation is a thick level of rock that doesn't have porosity, that is impermeable, and that rock acts as a cap. Fortunately, there are many, many, many locations around the world that have just that type of geologic formation. And indeed, it's the geology that allowed oil and gas to accumulate. The reason that there are oil and gas formations today, they weren't created yesterday, they were created hundreds of millions of years ago. The reason they're still there is that the geology keeps them from percolating to the surface. Well, that same geology would keep CO2 from percolating to the surface, provided that other people haven't gone and drilled holes into the formation and created a leakage pathway. That's why you need a regulatory environment to make sure that there are adequate surveys, that the pressures that are being used in the reservoir are safe, so that you don't wind up with seismic damage to the structural integrity of the formation. So that's a big misconception. If we have the science to do this right, we need the regulatory regime to make sure that the private sector operators that might use this, in fact, do it right.
Yeah, I know there were seismic studies done at the beginning of this project because of the Madrid fault and so forth. So, and we have an aquifer that's nearby, and that the study has seemingly been thorough enough that we're not worried about that. Greg, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one I also encounter is there enough space to store CO2 um, reliably and stably? And that David gave you the answer on that. But I think it's also one of the probably the most beneficial parts of this ADM project is that they are putting in maybe less than a million, but at least maybe 500,000 tons of CO2 into that reservoir every year for multiple years, and that they're monitoring it. And so to demonstrate how much leaks or that it doesn't leak, maybe even see what happens to it over time, that's exactly the type of kind of large scale study that we need to do, because that's big, and that's the size of a kind of almost the size of a coal plant in reverse, like in how much CO2 goes into the ground every year if they did it at full scale. So that would show a lot. The other misconception I come across with this carbon removal or carbon capture is that this is an alternative to reducing emissions other ways. So it's like, well, why don't we just do renewables or nuclear power or energy efficiency, and should we do this carbon capture? And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think about it the way that David introduced the topic, is that you do those things in a big way first, but the climate challenge is so much that we may need to actually do a large amount of this in the future, and it takes a while to develop technologies to be reliable, to prove the storage works, to set up the whole supply chain infrastructure for moving CO2 around. So we need to get to work on that and figure out if this is something we can rely on, or if we're going to have to find other solutions. And so that's the thing that I think is important for people to realize, is that people that work on this technology, it's not that they work on it instead of wind and solar and electric vehicles and all those other things that are really moving really quickly. It's in addition to it.
And from a ratepayer, taxpayer point of view, do you see if this technology moves forward, they'll be in a much more competitive field? Because at this point, to move ADM into a major project like this, and they certainly, quite a wealthy, huge company, it still took subsidies and basically energy department money to get this project going. It would seem over the long term, you wouldn't want to necessarily continue to pour money into something like this, particularly when the other projects just haven't worked out, from my understanding from Jonathan. Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong. So.
Yeah. And partly they're not working out because everything else is getting better. Everything else, including starting with fracking and natural gas getting cheap, with wind getting cheap, with solar getting cheap. And so part of the reason that this idea, like 15 years ago with this future gen concept, that we'd start doing carbon capture, get the cost down, and by now we'd have affordable carbon capture, even if that had been true, solar and wind and natural gas would still beat 10, 15 years of 30 demonstration plants of carbon capture. And so that's the problem that carbon capture has, that is even a worse problem today than it was 15 years ago. And you mentioned this other plant, or Jonathan mentioned it in his story, in Texas called Petronova. That was the second carbon capture and sequestration power plant in the world, full scale. They were removing a lot. But then they shut that down because the way that plant made money was partly by selling electricity, but also by selling the CO2 that they captured from the coal and selling it to oil company to pump into a depleted oil reserve and to get more oil out. Well, oil prices are really low now, maybe partly because electric vehicles are starting to dampen demand for oil. And so that's another reason why these plants are shutting down. It's not just the technology that's a problem, it's the economics. And the economics are harder for them now than they would have been 15 years ago. And no one in this industry that works on CCS would have wanted that to be the case. They all would have said, well, we'll get the cost down, and then by the 2020, we'll be building dozens of these every year all around the world. Wind, solar, batteries, natural gas are all undercutting the economics of these. So long term, we probably need some of it for a solution, but in terms of this near term gigantic market, these other technologies are just winning.
And I guess to look ahead, to jump past all this, there is a strong belief there will be a Biden administration. shortly. And I'd like a little bit of prediction of what you think that administration, and David's gone over how we've gone back and forth, what salient points do you think they'll go after? What do you think? What effective policies might they have, David? And then back to you, Greg. So out of this new administration, might be freezing, David. Let's see. I think you're freezing. Let's go to you, Greg, and then we'll see if David unfreezes. Okay.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration policies do depend somewhat on what happens in Georgia in January. So whether there's a Congress that will be at least potentially supportive of some of the initiatives of the Biden administration, or whether it's not at all, will affect whether we get legislation or whether we get agencies doing things in executive orders. In that second scenario, where the Democrats don't control the Senate, or there's just not enough Democrats in favor of doing a stringent climate policy, it really does look like Biden is kind of permeating climate change throughout his cabinet and throughout his administration. The appointees, or the proposed appointees so far, I mean, almost everywhere, from Treasury, EPA, energy, of course, but other places like housing and commerce and trade and ambassadors, that there's climate in all of their resumes, and it's part of the overall idea. So it does seem like there's kind of a broad effort to do things that seems to be designed to be robust to whatever happens in Georgia in January.
And sequestration would probably be some piece of this, do you think? David, I see your back, so.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very likely that that sequestration is going to be permitted as part of a strategy. Whether the Biden administration will put a big emphasis on it remains to be seen. Biden has already announced a pledge to have the U.S. power sector get to net zero emissions by 2035. And the long poles in that policy tent are going to be efficiency and renewables. But getting to net zero by 2035 would definitely stimulate more interest in carbon capture in the power sector. Probably not for coal plants. It makes sense for today's aging coal plants to just replace them. That's, their time has come and gone, and it doesn't make any sense to put a lot of expensive carbon capture equipment on those aging coal plants. They're much more sensible just to replace them. But gas plants are a different matter. We're still building gas plants. And so the question is, what's to be done with the emissions from those gas plants that were built in the last 5 years and the gas plants that are probably built in the next 5 years? That's a lot of emissions. It's half the emissions of coal from equivalent amount of capacity. So we shouldn't ignore those emissions. And if we can't stop using them fast enough from gas plants, then we should capture the carbon.
Is there one last question for me? And I know
something went wrong. Please try again.
So,
Sorry,
yeah.
something went wrong.
Sorry.
Siri's going to talk to us now. Yes.
Talking
So
about
one
the
other
carbon capture plants, actually.
Yeah, that's right. So one other thing I wanted.
That was a message for all of 2020.
Yes.
Right.
Not over soon enough. So one other thing I just wanted to touch on at a broad point is something that the Midwesterners continue to pursue, which is looking at emissions throughout the agribusiness, throughout that industry. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts of what kind of, if there's any other carbon capture that goes with the covering of crops, which has come up with one of our questions, anything having to do with the cattle and the way we eat so much meat and the methane and so forth. Are there any other efforts in the agribusiness industry other than ethanol that you think we'll see moves on or policy? And I'm just curious about that, because the agribusiness industry is so large and affects so many different things. And I
Yeah.
guess I'll ask Greg.
I mean, yeah, the one that seems like easiest, not easiest, but is the soil carbon capture. David mentioned that early. You know, that if you could do a couple of things like low till and cover crops, that seems to make a huge difference. The two big issues there. One is how permanent is that? So you have to keep that up. And if you plow your fields after 5 years, then you probably lose a lot of that carbon. So that's one issue. And then two is, how do you monitor, measure, and verify that you're actually removing and storing carbon in your soils? And, you know, if there's a way, that's probably where we need some policy to create some incentives and rewards. And then I would assume there'd be a lot of entrepreneurial activity that comes up in terms of certifying that and providing measurement services and that type of thing, which itself could become kind of an agricultural service business. So the soil carbon capture seems really important. And then on the other hand, that's on the supply side on agriculture. On the other hand, you know, got up early for a meeting with Japanese and Europeans this morning, and that is really discussing this shift to low meat diets and how that, you know, could potentially be one way, and they really talking about it as a way to avoid doing this really large scale carbon removal, that in addition to some other things to reduce energy consumption. And you know, I think that's something that I think that agribusiness would be, you know, good to pay attention to, because, you know, consumer tastes and preferences, especially among young people who are very socially connected and can, you know, influence the behavior of each other really quickly because they're so connected, you know, could play a role in changing the demand for different types of produce and crops from agriculture.
Yeah, David, anything to add on that one? Yeah.
Well, yes, I agree with Greg's observations. I think that you know, first, greenhouse gases from agricultural activities are very significant, and as we crack down on the power sector, as we electrify vehicles, as we go after industrial emissions, the remaining emissions from the agriculture sector are going to loom larger and larger. So it's very important for us to think about how to effectively change practices to get those emissions reduced. My hunch is that for the next 5 years or so, at least, the politicians, the elected politicians, are going to be pretty leery about putting in place anything that looks like a mandatory obligation. They're probably, if they're going to act, they're probably going to rely on subsidies, and that actually the social license for agricultural policies and practices may be a more powerful driver. So, you know, we saw with the ozone destroying chemicals, we saw that consumers just said, we don't want to keep using underarm deodorants and hairsprays that is killing the atmosphere. And that put enormous pressure on the companies. Now, you know, you could see a similar evolution where all of us who eat food, which I think is the entire panel, you know, we start to think about, okay, what does the chain of pollution look like that is behind the food that we consume? And are there things that the agriculture sector could do to reduce that pollution? And so that provides a role for academia, putting out studies that unveil that information. Groups like mine, Natural Resources Defense Council, where we put out reports that try to describe the amount of pollution that flows from these activities and what are practical things that could be done that do not restrict people's lifestyles, that do not impair the food supply to cut that pollution. And that may be what produces the most progress in the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay. We're getting near an hour, and although we have more time, I generally find on Zoom the clock starts really ticking, definitely with my students. So I wanted to see if Jonathan had any follow-up questions. He got pretty deep into all this, so I don't want to eliminate that possibility. So, Jonathan, did you have anything we should have touched on?
No, I thought this discussion was really great. I mean, I really learned a lot and thought it really helped inform the story and kind of more questions going forward, I guess. But yeah, I mean, thank you.
Yeah, and certainly by Jonathan working on the story and me reading a lot of things over the years, I got over the idea of how I used to make fun of carbon sequestration, saying, is that just a 7,000 foot deep hole that you pour things into? So I got over that a while ago. I'm glad you guys explained that that's one of the misconceptions that that you hear all the time. Do we have it, Pam? Do we have any questions left from the
Double
audience?
checking. Anybody else, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get a few minutes and wrap this up. This conversation will be available on YouTube and our Facebook page and our website. I'll share those links out, follow up, but I'm not seeing any more hands. Again, we definitely give thanks to our speakers, Dr. Nemeth, Mr. Hawkins, Brant Houston for moderating, Jonathan, of course, for joining us, and certainly the support from the Lumpkin Family Foundation. Thank you very much for making this possible. So with that, I think I'm not seeing questions, hands, anyone?
No, and I just want to thank the speakers and Jonathan. I think there are a lot of different parts to all of this. Jonathan's article did a good job of it. There'll be some more down the line, I'm sure, but I really appreciate both you, Greg and David, for spending time on this and with Jonathan on the story. I think it's going to be a continuing education, and having this recording is something that I will get out to some friends in the academy and friends in journalism so they could have a nice tutorial. This was a really nice one. I really appreciate it. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
So sorry, we do have a question in the Q&A from Kevin McKee. We have a lot of old oil fields in the Midwest. What is the potential for injecting CO2 into those old oil fields? There's a tongue twister, pardon me. Old oil fields.
The oil fields can hold carbon CO2. Again, in order to do it securely, the fields would need to be carefully surveyed. All of the existing wells would need to be inspected and probably re-cemented so that they don't provide a leakage pathway. Again, you would have to monitor the injection pressures and the pressures in the formations. So yes, those fields could be a reservoir, but as the Archer Daniels Midland project implies, there are these other formations, the so-called deep saline formations, which also exist in abundance in the Midwest. So the problem, if there is a problem, is not a shortage of of geologies to put the CO2. It's, again, to return to my very first point, the problem is the lack of a policy imperative to do it.
Got it. Okay.
I hope
Well, thanks very much, Pam. Anything else?
It doesn't appear to be. And again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Brant for moderating, and Jonathan, and certainly to the Lumpkin Family Foundation for supporting this work. I suppose we will call it a night.
Okay.
Last call for questions, 11th hour, 11th going once, twice.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.